All right, welcome in everyone. My name is Adrian Palmer, and I am a second year medical student, and I have my MS in biomedical sciences. But really, I think what's most important is I am from rural southern Indiana, and I am interested in giving back to my community. So I'll let my partner here introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Katelyn McGuire. I also go by Cater. I am also from rural southern Indiana. We are both alum of North Posey High School. And I have my master's in public health, so I'm a public health professional.
So we wanted to make a video discussing COVID-19 and the vaccine. Caitlin and I have seen a lot of things on Facebook, and we just decided that it would be nice if a couple of hometown folks use the degrees that we got to share some of our information. So let me pull that up. Make it big for everybody. All right, can you see this okay, Caitlin?
Yes, I can.
First and only time I've ever called you that, I think. It's odd for me. So like any good presentation, we've got a few learning objectives here. Essentially, we're just going to start by taking you through what is COVID-19, understanding some of the signs, the differences between COVID and the flu. And then the second half of this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the vaccine, what an mRNA vaccine is, and some of the differences between the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So who's this presentation for? For anybody who is interested in factual information about COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccine. Between Caitlin and I, we feel pretty comfortable talking about this, and we spend a lot of time digging through a lot of really good resources to pare this all down for you.
All right, so what are the differences between the common flu and COVID-19? Now, I'm down in Tennessee now, and I have worked in the public health sector down here. I've seen a lot of individuals just kind of not be sure what the differences are between the flu and COVID-19, how to tell the difference, why COVID-19 is in the news so much recently. So I actually did COVID response, and I answered a lot of the COVID questions that people had. So this first part of the presentation is just going to go through COVID-19 and all the knowledge we have on it, basically, and that's where I come in. So the flu and COVID-19 are both respiratory diseases. They impact the respiratory tract. Now, where they really differ is how long someone is contagious. So for the flu, people are generally contagious 1 day before they start to show symptoms, and then 7 days after they start showing symptoms. With COVID-19, people can be contagious up to 2 days before they start showing symptoms, and then 10 days after. So when you hear a lot of the isolation information talking about you need to isolate for 10 days after you test positive or after you show symptoms, that is where that number comes from, because you are contagious throughout those days. And that's also why if you do get diagnosed with COVID-19, whether that is through a test and you're asymptomatic or you don't have any symptoms, or it's through symptoms, when the public health professionals call you and ask you information, they're usually going to go back and say, okay, in the past 2 days, who have you been in contact with? So that way they can help alert those people if they need to. So now, when do people start actually showing symptoms? The flu, it's usually between the 1st and 4th day after exposure. For COVID-19, it can be anywhere between 2 to 14 days. So when you're told to quarantine, that's why you're told 14 days, because you can actually show symptoms all the way up until that 14th day. It can get day 14, and then you show symptoms, and then you have to quarantine or isolate for those 10 days. So the mortality rate, this is where a lot of people are kind of iffy about what's going on in the world. So the mortality rate for the flu is 0.1%. Yearly, that's about 290,000 to 650,000 deaths. Now that's a lot of deaths. But for COVID-19, just since the start of this pandemic, That mortality rate is about 3 to 4%, with 1.9 million all the way up until, I believe that was the beginning of January already. So that's a lot of deaths as well. Going through this pandemic, we have to remember what scale we're thinking of. So what are the common symptoms of COVID-19? A lot of people will demonstrate fever or chills. They'll have a cough, they'll have that shortness of breath or difficulty breathing. Now you can also have fatigue, muscle or body aches, headache. One hallmark sign of this virus is that new loss of taste or smell. So that's something they found is very specific to this virus. And it's something that people say comes out of nowhere. Sore throat, congestion or runny nose, nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. So as you can see, a lot of the symptoms can also be mistaken for flu symptoms. So if you are ever in doubt, go ahead and get tested. So emergency symptoms. When we say we want you to isolate or we want you to quarantine, that means we want you to stay home, but that does not mean do not seek medical care if you need it. A lot of people might be afraid to seek medical care just because, you know, they don't want to infect other people, or they're afraid there might be a stigma around them. Whatever it may be, do not be afraid to seek medical care if you need it. So when we're talking about these emergency symptoms, we're talking about trouble breathing. You can't catch your breath if you have a pulsometer at home. If it's low 90s, that's when you need to be going to the ER to talk with the doctor. Make sure when you go in, you tell them that you've tested positive for COVID-19 or you've had symptoms. Persistent pain or pressure in the chest, new confusion, inability to wake or stay awake, or bluish lips or face. If your face or lips are starting to turn blue, that's a sign that your body is not getting enough oxygen. So when we talk about numbers, people always wonder, well, how does this impact me? How does this impact my community? And this here is information as of the week of Christmas, so December 25th. And this shows some Evansville area hospitals and their capacity right now. So those ICU beds are at 93.8% at Deaconess, 100% at Ascension, St. Vincent. So when you're thinking about those ICU beds, COVID-19 is taking over a lot of those beds. And unfortunately, that means if someone were to have a heart attack, or if someone were to have a stroke, or if someone were to need immediate care and they need to be taken to the ICU because of some trauma, there might not be a bed available to them, and they might have to go to a different hospital further away to get the care that they need. So how do you prevent the spread of COVID-19? Number one thing, make sure you're washing your hands. So when you wash your hands, you should be washing with warm, soapy water at least 20 seconds. If you're a singer, sing happy birthday a couple of times. You can get through it, and then there's your 20 seconds for washing your hands. Also, wear a mask. Now, don't go around wearing the hospital grade masks. Please leave those masks for health professionals who need them in the hospitals, in the clinics. Let the health professionals have their masks. Cloth masks are definitely perfect for everyday people walking around, going to the grocery, going to the store. Wear those cloth masks. When you're wearing those cloth masks, make sure you're covering both your nose and your mouth, because how this transmits is through droplets from your respiratory tract. So if you were to sneeze, or if you're talking or singing, or if you're coughing, then those droplets can actually go through the air, transmit to other people. Social distance. So that's why everything is 6 feet apart, is we want y'all to social distance. So social distancing helps to decrease the amount of respiratory droplets that can get to another person. This is not a substitute for wearing masks. You should also be wearing masks when possible. And then the last thing is to monitor your health. So make sure you're taking daily checks of your health. How are you feeling? Are you feeling like you're having a fever? Are you feeling like you're having any shortness of breath, any cough, anything like that? Make sure you're monitoring your health and taking good care of yourself, so that way, if you were to start exhibiting symptoms or if you were to come down with COVID-19, then you're healthy enough to go ahead and recognize that and battle it as well. So quarantine. You hear a lot of quarantine and isolation. So we're here to kind of break this down. What's the difference? So who needs to quarantine? A quarantine is anyone who is a close contact to a positive case of COVID-19. So that positive case is either testing positive or being told by a doctor, health professional, hey, you have COVID-19. What counts as a close contact? Now this has changed a little bit. So you need to be within 6 feet for greater than 15 minutes. Or you need to have physical contact, like hugging or kissing someone, or sharing utensils, like drinking utensils, eating utensils, anything where that saliva was passed back and forth. And then what are the steps to take if you're told to quarantine? Stay at home for those 14 days after an exposure and watch for symptoms of COVID-19. If you are having symptoms, make sure you report those symptoms to a doctor if you're able to do like a telecommunication. And just talk with them about what symptoms you're having. Once again, like I mentioned earlier, do not avoid medical care if you need it. And then isolation. So who should isolate? People who test positive for COVID-19 or who have COVID-19 symptoms should isolate. So when we're isolating, we're taking away the people who are sick away from the people who are healthy. So what are the next steps when you're told to isolate? Stay home. Try to use a separate bedroom, a separate bathroom from others in your household if it's possible. Try to stay away even from the people in your household so you don't transmit it throughout your house as well. And then when can you be released? So the CDC recommends 10 days after initial symptoms, but you have to have 24 hours of being fever-free. And your symptoms need to be improving. And then it could also be 10 days past a positive test if you have no symptoms or if you're presenting as asymptomatic.
All right, so switching gears a little bit here, I'm going to start talking about this vaccine. And I feel like in the healthcare community, we've gotten a lot of questions. And so I'm here to answer what I hope is some of what I consider to be the fair questions. So I've heard from a lot of people, this seems really fast for the vaccine to come out. Why is it, or how did it get out so fast? What even is an mRNA vaccine, and why haven't we had one before? I've got a lot of questions on the difference between the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And people are asking, how do we know that it's safe? I think that those are all pretty fair questions that I'm going to try to answer here in the next few minutes. And then there are some questions out there that I think are what I would say are beyond my scope. I have this little figure over here to the left. You know, I've heard everything from there are blinking lights that are going to be put on your arm, that Bill Gates is going to make 5G available through these. Those are not questions that I am here to answer. I'm here to answer some of the more science-based questions. So how did it happen so fast? We really about Operation Warp Speed. A lot of you have probably heard about it on NPR. I've got a little bit of text here that explains pretty well what it is, but I'm going to talk about that text because nobody likes to read that much things. So essentially what happened with Operation Warp Speed is our federal government decided to streamline the process for vaccinations. Instead of each individual pharmaceutical company creating their own protocols, the federal government set forth a series of protocols so that every study would have the same kind of process. That's going to make it a lot easier for the federal government to evaluate those vaccines. And the other thing that they did was they allowed a lot of steps of the process to happen simultaneously. So if you look at the bottom, kind of that last slide about there being a financial risk, what Pfizer and Moderna both did was when they were in step or the first stage of clinical trials, they went ahead and started producing on a mass scale in the hopes that that vaccine would work. In the event that that vaccine didn't work, they were going to have to dump all that they had created at that point. So if you see money being funneled into some of these things, think about that money was really going to start this large scale production early, which is why we've actually been able to get the vaccine out so fast. So what is an mRNA vaccine? And I apologize that we have to go back a little bit to Bio 101 and understand what mRNA is before we move on to that. So we have DNA, which is our genetic material. It goes through a process called transcription and turns into mRNA. It gets translated into proteins. This meant nothing to me for a very long time. So I've made the next slide, and hopefully that makes it a little simpler for everybody, including myself, to understand. So I think of DNA as the instruction manual for who you are. It's everything from how to grow skin, how to grow fingernails, how your internal organs work. But for this process, I kind of think of it as if all of IKEA had an instruction manual for everything to build in IKEA. But all you really need is up with this one chair. You don't need the instructions for how to put the bed frame together, how to put the table together. You just need those instructions for this one chair. So essentially what mRNA does is it's just taking one piece from that instruction manual, just that single page that you need. So here you see I've got the one, I think it's 2-3 steps. I admittedly am terrible at reading directions. I'm the kind of person who likes to just go for it. But for sake of this, it's that single page that you need. And then the translation is actually the process of taking that single page and building your chair or building whatever it is that you need at the end. So this vaccine comes in at that mRNA stage. So this is the tricky part. On the left, I have the dreaded COVID-19 vaccine, or the dreaded COVID-19 molecule. And something that scientists have to look for, can you actually see the little cursor as I move it out of curiosity? Yeah. Scientists look for when designing a vaccine is something that is specific to that organism that you do not have in your body, because we want to be able to target it without targeting you. So something you might have heard talked about are these spike proteins, which are all these little red things on the outside of this here. This is something that's unique to the COVID-19 virus. That is something that you don't have. So scientists were able to find out, or essentially start with that spike protein and figure out how it was built. So they went back to that single instruction manual page. And then from there, they wanted to target this single spike protein. So what they've done is they have taught your cells through that instruction manual, through this mRNA vaccine, how to manufacture that spike protein. So once it gets into your cells actually make the spike protein, and they're going to show it off on its surface. Your immune system is immediately going to recognize that thing doesn't belong here. It's going to destroy that. And then if it ever comes in contact with it again, so for example, if you were to get exposed to COVID-19, it would have that response ready to go. So essentially what we've done is we have targeted these spike proteins in a way so that it's not going to target your cells later on. So a couple of things about it, because that can be a little scary to say. I want to talk about what this vaccine is not. So it is not live. Like I was explaining, it just takes that one small spike protein. It teaches cells what that is so that you can mount a response to it later. There are some vaccines that are live attenuated, which means they're a weaker strand, but this is not the case with this vaccine. Since it is not a live vaccine, there's really no chance that you are going to get COVID-19 from this vaccine. That's just not how it works. I've heard people are worried that this might change their DNA or their genome. So in the process of transcription and translation, your mRNA is outside of the nucleus, where your DNA is inside of the nucleus. This vaccine is never going to come into contact with your DNA. It hangs out in what's called the cytoplasm, but it will never even be in the same DNA. It's not going to mix. It's not going to integrate. That's not how this works. The next thing, it's not going to stick around. So after the mRNA gets used by your cells, it's going to get degraded by a very natural process in your cells that they already do. So they're going to recognize this thing has essentially served its purpose, and then they're going to degrade it. It's not going to go to other cells. It doesn't move like a virus. and it's certainly not going to hang around very long. And this last bit, I've heard a lot of people say, well, this is a brand new vaccine. And while that's true, this is our first currently approved mRNA vaccine. This technology has been in development from the early 90s. This is a picture that I like to show of some of the trajectory of the mRNA development. This is actually where mRNA has been used a lot in cancer research. And you can see this goes clear back to the early 90s of us using this. And then what a lot of people know is that COVID-19 is actually not the first mRNA vaccine. To the left, no, to the right, I have several other vaccines that are currently in trials and have been much longer than the COVID-19 vaccine. Why haven't we had one before? Well, if you look at some of these things on this list, we've got rabies, Zika virus, tuberculosis. Okay, a lot of these things, not enough people get infected with them for us to have a robust enough clinical trial to approve the vaccine. So that's a bit of the struggle with a vaccine and the clinical trial process is it's not ethical once someone gets COVID-19 vaccine in a clinical trial to then expose them to COVID-19. Ideally, they would never get COVID-19. We're not going to expose them intentionally. But because this has been a global pandemic, it means a lot of people are exposed anyways. So we had enough people who were willing to sign up to volunteer to get the vaccine. And then we were able to follow them to see how many of them really ended up with COVID-19, which is why this one has really passed all of the other ones on this list. It's actually cut off on the bottom, but there's been several studied for the flu as well. So about Pfizer versus Moderna. If you're trying to avoid an mRNA vaccine, I've got bad news for you. That's really your only option. So it's going to be an mRNA vaccine. These are largely very similar. You're going to need 2 doses. So think of that second dose as essentially a booster shot. For Pfizer, it's going to be 21 days apart. For Moderna, 28 days apart. Where I feel like a lot of the differences come in here is in the storage, which is why I took a couple of points here for both of those. If you notice, Pfizer has to be stored at just incredibly cold temperatures. Realistically, your neighborhood pharmacy, your primary care physician, they're not going to have the kinds of freezers that you need to store this long term. This is going to be something that will likely have the access to, but the CVS on the end of the corner just isn't going to have this. So there's your long-term storage. Short-term storage is fairly similar across the way, so they can be stored for Pfizer up to 5 days, for Moderna up to 30 at essentially a refrigerated temperature. And then once you get to room temperature, Pfizer lasts about 2 hours at room temperature, Moderna about 6 hours. So I suspect in the future we will probably see more of Moderna going to our primary care providers, available at CVS's or Walgreens. But I think that that's pretty unlikely for the Pfizer vaccine. I could be wrong, but that's kind of speculating here based on the temperatures that I'm seeing. Both of them have been found highly effective. Pfizer is at 95%, Moderna at 4.1, so very little difference there. And then the last bit is Pfizer did include in their initial clinical trials 16 and 17-year-olds. Moderna did not. So when it came time for FDA approval, Pfizer was able to get it approved for 16 and older because they had included those individuals in their clinical trials. Moderna only for 18 and older because they didn't have anyone under than that yet. Both Pfizer and Moderna are currently working, looking to see if it is effective in those younger than 16 and younger than 18. But those are populations that we just like to protect a little more. There are a lot of rules around children and infants, as there absolutely should be. So this is just taking us a little while longer to find out. And then this last bit, how do we know that it's safe? So at the very beginning, I talked a lot about Operation Warp Speed and how it really streamlined the process. But that doesn't mean that it got rid of any of the safety standards. The FDA has incredibly rigorous safety standards, and they have held everyone to those same safety standards. So while a lot of the red tape was cut, the safety standards were all still put in place. Throughout trials, there is monitoring of adverse side effects, of adverse events. So those all get reported as part of the data for the clinical trials. I just wanted to put in here, there are some common side effects. Most vaccines are going to have these. It's that really fast blurb at the end of every single drug commercial you ever hear. So I've included a few of the more common ones here: pain at injection site, fatigue, headache, chills, joint pain, fever. Basically, a lot of these are going to happen because your body does have to mount a response to it. It has to create those antibodies and essentially let your immune system gear up for if it gets attacked for real. So you may feel there's the potential. You may feel cruddy for a day or a day and a half after your vaccine. That is completely normal. That is just your body responding and getting prepared for the next potential event. So if you have any of those, just know. The other thing about this that I like to throw out there is that even though these have been approved through that emergency use authorization, they are continuing now for those side effects. So when you get an opportunity to get your vaccine, you will see on the wall the chance for you to actually report any adverse event that you may have. This is just a way for the FDA to continue to monitor if for some reason there would be a adverse event that came up here in the general public that didn't happen in the clinical trials. Those are all followed, those are all kept up to date. But I just like to tell people that even though the vaccine's out, that doesn't mean that the clinical trials stop. They continue on for quite a while, even once it gets out to the public. And then this last bit here, I just wanted to put in a bonus kind of myth to bust. Is there's a lot of folks who've been trying to find kind of any reason not to get this vaccine. And one of the weird ones that I've heard is about Bell's palsy. So this is essentially a condition where it typically affects half your face, and it kind of makes half of your face. In a typical year, you see about 23 incidences per about 1,000 people. For Moderna, 3 folks, technically 4, but there were 3 who got the vaccine and 1 who got a placebo. So 3 or 4, depending on how you look at that, out of 30,000. And for Pfizer, it was 4 out of their about 38,000. If you actually do the math on that, that figures up to be less than the actual normal incidence of Bell's palsy. So you could almost make the argument here that, maybe it's better for Bell's palsy. I would certainly not make that argument, but I just like to throw out here that when we look at the actual incidence of Bell's palsy in the studies versus in the general population, there is no real difference here that we can point out. So I'm going to slide through our references here. Hopefully that has answered some of your questions about COVID-19 and the vaccine. And I'll turn it over to Katelyn here to end us out.
Well, thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, please feel free to reach out and contact us. Our contact information is here at the end. We're just so happy to be able to give back to our community that brought us up into the people we are today. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great New Year.